It's 4:30 and we're going to go ahead and start. We have folks on Zoom, and so we have to use our microphone so they can hear us. So welcome everyone to this event. We're calling this A Campus to Call Home, a conversation on identity, belonging, and space at Mizzou. It makes complete sense that the Middleton Center should hold an event like this. And so I just want to set up the reason why we're holding this event, the origins of this event. These three young ladies came to visit with me last year, and they were concerned about the tearing down of Reed Hall on our campus. And they're concerned, they're all historians, and they were concerned with the fact that Reed Hall was a historical building and had a lot of significance because it was the first place that women could stay at the University of Missouri. And as we started having these conversations about what they were doing to raise the alarm about that building, we also started thinking about, well, yes, it was a place for women, but not Black women. So then it became a conversation about not only women, but also race and all kinds of other conversations. And so we thought it would be great to have a conversation about all of it. So we're going to have this event that a wonderful panel where the three historians will begin with their research, because they actually did a lot of research on Reed Hall. And then we wanted to sort of zoom out and think about other ways in which the University of Missouri has been a welcoming place or not over the course of its history. And so we'll start with Jordan, Catherine, and Bailey, and then we'll bring up three other very special guests so that we can talk more about other areas of the campus and what the campus has felt like on a personal level, but also in terms of the organizations that have lived here. I want to thank Kate Kelly, who is our support at the Middleton Center, and also Kelly Buckheit, who is our tireless events coordinator for the College of Arts and Science. Also thanks to the College of Arts and Science and the School of Law for their support of the Middleton Center. As always, if he's in the room or on the Zoom, I always thank Michael Middleton, who is here, and really thankful that he allows us to continue this work under his name. So we're going to go ahead and start. So the structure of the event is that Catherine, Bailey, and Jordan will begin. They'll present for about 15 minutes. And then we will call up our three other panelists. They will each speak for about 5 minutes, and that will open our scope a little bit. And then we'll have hopefully a really good dialogue moderated by my co-director, David Mitchell. I almost said David Middleton. You must have a granddaughter or a grandson called David. Okay, so David Mitchell will come and co-anchor after the presentations. And I'm Stephanie Shonikan. I co-direct this with David. All right, so first and foremost, we will turn the mic over to our three wonderful historians. Jordan Pellerito, who is a PhD candidate in history, also affiliated with the Kinder Institute for Constitutional Democracy, who studies memory and national identity in public sites. And then Catherine Huttonett. Catherine, wave. And Catherine is in her first year of a master's program here in history as well. And she studies Atlantic history and politics, as in particular women and history and his historical preservation. And then thirdly, Bailey Martin Bailey is a junior, and she is also in history, and is a Kinder Fellow also, and she studies public history and white violence. And so they are facing all of us, including their chair, Linda Reeder, who is sitting up here like a proud mama. Okay, so over to the historians.
Okay. Oh, cool. Oh, okay. Very fancy. Okay, so we wanted to first kind of give an overview of the architectural significance of our university. I think a lot of us can kind of look at Mizzou and be like, well, it's just Missouri. Like, how much can it actually matter? At least, you know, when you're 19 and jaded, when you first come here, maybe that's what you think. So it's actually, our university is part of a much longer tradition of this architectural ancestry that we've been calling it. And it is a chosen architectural ancestry. Of course, this is all imagined. In the United States, the creation of these aesthetics that we now associate with universities is a relatively recent history. And to kind of illustrate this, I'd like to examine a very famous quote from President Woodrow Wilson. Though in this quote, he is not president of the United States, rather president of Princeton University. At a dinner all too familiar on a cold December night, President Wilson addressed the gathered audience of university administrators and wealthy alumni. Here, he was discussing the new buildings constructed on the campus, stating, "By the very simple device of building our new buildings in the Tudor Gothic style, we seem to have added to Princeton to the age of Oxford and Cambridge. We added 1,000 years to the history of Princeton by merely putting those lines in our buildings, which point every man's imagination to the historical traditions of learning in the English-speaking race." Now, while this speech shows the familiar trend of university's president, of course, to pull at the nostalgic memories of those wealthy alumni and invite them to imagine the campus they once called home, it also shows the really important role architecture plays in the creation of campus identity, which my fellow panelists will talk to you about in a minute. And so, especially in the United States, where the oldest universities are still more than half a millennia younger than their counterparts in colleges in Oxford and Cambridge, this collegiate Gothic architecture created a collective imagination of a deep historical past for universities whose mortar was still hardening. And so, to kind of draw more into where this started, historians love dates. If you want to put a date on it, 1288. 1288 is really where this is stemming from. Merton College, they have the bright idea to take a building for students and enclose it around a physical green space. In addition to this green space, of course, here they invent the quad that many of us associate with those fun, shows on TBS where there's kids like throwing frisbees or whatever. Invented at Merton for, stuck-up people learning seminary and things like that 500 years ago. They also create something that we are quite literally sitting in, and that is towers that make you envision the space you're in as an extension of the heavens, and especially for places who are seeking to make these places very elite, having that very direct connection to the heavens is really useful. And so we're going to jump about 500 years, which is something you probably shouldn't do in history, but we're going to do it anyway. And we're going to start in the United States. So why does Woodrow Wilson care about it 500 years later, 700 years later by then, I suppose? And its origins there begin at Bryn Mawr College, which is, of course, the famous women's university. And through two people, Cope and Stewardson. Now, many of you, if you've been on the university campus for a while, Cope and Stewardson quite literally construct over 50 buildings on this campus. We made a beautiful histogram that if we had a PowerPoint, we'd show you, but you'll have to trust us. Over 50 buildings on this campus, you can draw from Cope and Stewardson and their later iteration, Jameson and Spurl. Both of these, they're basically just like hand-me-downs. I'm not going to get into it, but they come from studying in places like England and Scotland. They want to emulate that here. But they make a really interesting choice, and that is to get rid of those square courtyards that enclose people and instead put their places on the outside. So think of our quad here. It is a very open space. There aren't really gates, things like that. It's accessible to the public. And yet, even though, you know, campuses are, we'll talk about, constructed with this very elite sense, we're starting to slowly see how in the infrastructure, they're starting to slowly become more open. But then we have our case study, Reed Hall, who of course is, if you don't know, just 2 buildings that way, built in a very open and public space, but for women. The last thing you want these fine ladies to do is to get into trouble. So putting them into prominent positions on campus where there can be some checks and balances, for lack of a better word, is really important. And so I'm going to speed this along. But the legacy of Coed and Stewardson and Jamison and Spurl are very much alive to this campus today. Quite literally, this entire section of campus is built by them. They try to redesign the Dome of Jesse before it gets rejected. You cannot walk on this campus without stepping in their footsteps. And of course, their first building on this campus is Reed Hall. So it truly would be a shame to get rid of Reed Hall when it is such a long legacy of this broad and transatlantic history of campus aesthetics. So I'm going to hand it over to them.
Yeah, so I'm going to just talk a little bit about like women's history at Mizzou, and that's sort of the lens at which I'm bringing it. That's kind of what I'll be talking about, and sort of how we perceive the building and why we wanted to save it is because of this like long and rich history, and also, I mean, the way that Reed Hall makes you grapple with much more than just women's history. It's also a history of inclusion and exclusion, as well as like the ways in which our institution attempts to like police and control what it deems to be the other. So, you know, talking about like the architecture of the building that was made for like to allow like vigilance to ensure that these women were constantly being watched and guarded from their male peers. But really, like Reed Hall, and I think women's like history and where it starts at Missouri, at our university, is so interesting because in many ways it is like a forerunner. It comes 100 years, admittance into the university comes 100 years before, you know, its counterparts along the East Coast, before like Princeton. And it is like very selective, so it's exclusive to like women who can afford it. It first starts at the normal school, but it's not. It's something that like continues to grow. Women are eventually allowed into the rest of the university, but in incredibly like small numbers. There's an effort to like make an entirely like separate institution and a separate physical space to exclude women from interacting with men on campus. But really kind of drawing it into like why we started this. It was, I think, a perception of like challenging our institution to deal with its history, to grapple and be transparent with its past, to get it to like identify with time periods that it should be proud of. So we should be proud of the fact that like we were among the first to allow women in, but we also need to think critically about the fact that it was white, rich women, and that we have like failed incredibly in the past. Also, just as like a side note, this history isn't about like Daniel Reed. I mean, it's not. Daniel Reed.
You'd be surprised. You laughed. You'd be surprised how many times that question has come up.
Yeah. So Daniel Reed did do a lot. Like he's the one who established the normal school, and I think he was actually very strategic in that. He established a normal school, which is like a school to prepare women, and then was like, oh, only 4 men attended our normal school. I think like since women are more like naturally inclined to teaching and who serve in these positions, like let's open up the university to women. And then within like 5 years, it was open to all departments. But it's not about Daniel Reed. But please like ask me questions about like women's history at Mizzou. I just wanted to be kind of general. But.
So what originally began as a very narrow focus, I think, on women's history, that was the original purpose of our interest in Reed Hall, why we were so intent on saving it in the first place, quickly kind of spiraled into a broader interest in the role of history on university campuses and the role that the physical built environment actually plays in this. So what I have been doing with this is starting some initial research on who buildings are named after on campus, their purposes, what they've served, to look at the ways that they're meant for the community on campus, how they build an identity on campus, how they other people, how they support people, how they don't. So what started as women's history turned into architecture, and we could quickly learn that, like most other things, architecture has a very racist past, which is something Catherine is working on a lot. And so this is something that has gone just from women to bigger questions of how campuses are designed, their architecture, who's building them, why they're being built, where they're placed, who they're named after. And these things all, I would say, reflect the history that a university values and the one that it celebrates. History, especially for schools like the University of Missouri, which we use Mizzou and Reed Hall as a case study in this. Universities use their history to capitalize on enrollment, like it's something they promote to people to try to get students and faculty to come here. And Mizzou is a very good example of that, right? Like if you go on their official website, they have a very small portion dedicated to Mizzou history. It's 3 or 4 sentences, it's not a ton, but it's things like we're the first university west of the Mississippi, the first public university. We're University of Virginia's sister school. We have the Thomas Jefferson legacy, first journalism school, homecoming, right? Like we invented homecoming, quote unquote. I think it's still disputed, but it's something we take, right? So it's very clear that Mizzou values its history, and we see that ideologically and through what it promotes and how it appeals to people and tries to bring people in. But we also see it physically. It's not like Reed Hall is one of a series of buildings that Mizzou doesn't see a problem with demolishing or getting rid of for any reason, because they have historic preservation on campus. Jesse Hall, all of the buildings around the historic quad are on the National Register of Historic Places. So there is emphasis on the built environment and the history that it serves here. It's just whose history and for what purpose. And so it's asking bigger questions about what history Mizzou feels comfortable using for admissions, for retention, for advertisement, for homecoming when it invites its alumni home every year. And kind of asking why we're not being proactive about the history that we approach and that we use, because a lot of other schools like the Yales, the Princetons, the Oxfords are being proactive about their legacies of slavery or sexual assault or other oppressions. And Mizzou has not really done that yet. And the way it's going, it kind of seems like we're going to be reactive to it, which is not a good position to be in. We've had many instances and tensions over the Thomas Jefferson statue and tombstone on the quad, and we know it kind of ends the same way every single time. And this is another example of that built environment aspect, right? Whose history is being presented on campus? What does it represent to people? What does it mean to different people? So it's not to like vilify the university. It's not to say that Mizzou doesn't value history, because we know it does. It's more of seeing physically and promotionally why it constructs and values the history the way it does. And this is a good example of the difference between the past and history. So the past is literally everything that has ever happened. We can never, ever know everything about the past. The history, the histories of things and people and places are constructed. People write them, people argue them. Things can be left out, things can be exaggerated, right? They're very intentionally constructed. And so university history, especially used for promotional purposes, is a very good example of that. Mizzou is clearly picking the parts of its history that it wants to broadcast to people, to draw people in, the journalism school, homecoming, all of those things, but it's leaving out the unfavorable or questionable parts of its past, which is not only doing a disservice just generally to history, right? But it's also still relating to contemporary conversations on campus about race and gender. Where do students see themselves represented? From my research so far, I've looked at main campus, which I consider like the main space that undergrads are most likely to be on. So the quad, this historic women's campus over here. I know there's parts like across Providence and whatnot, but this main campus. So far in my research, we're more likely to be in a building named for a white man. So this could be a university president, administrator, professor, alumni, donor, a politician, right? There's several different groups of this. And it's not surprising, we're more likely to be in a building named for a white person, especially on the quad. If you consider buildings named for women, there's 9 named individually just for women, 10 if you count Cornell, which is named for a married couple. there's 4 named for African Americans. So this is not just commemorating or recognizing people by naming buildings after them, but it's also, you know, in promoting the university to students and potential faculty and trying to draw people in. Do these people see themselves represented on campus? And why or why not? And what does that say about the history that the university actually engages with? So this still has, I mean, this chosen narrative of Mizzou still has broader implications on a lot of social issues today. And it's something that the university, I think, has not taken enough consideration of how history plays into these things. And so we're always advocating for the role of historians in like every conversation, right? It's something we do. We love history, but I think this is a very good example and a good call for increasing historical literacy on campuses. So it goes beyond Reed Hall and all of its significance, right? It's very special to us. It's very important to us, but we realize it's kind of a broader, I guess, reflection of bigger issues on campus. And so why do students not know what buildings are named after? Why do they not know that they have several classes throughout their 4 years of undergrad in Middlebush Hall when President Middlebush of the university actively fought to keep the school segregated? Why do they not know that he actively consulted with other presidents around the country to punish gay students? Like, why do we not know these things about our history? Why are they not broadly advertised? We know they're not the bright, shiny, really appealing things. But again, if we don't tackle them before people start realizing these things and find them out on their own, then we're being reactive instead of proactive and trying to embrace these aspects of our history and cope with them and make up for them and do what we can with them. And so this is, you know, people always ask us where Reed Hall is. And we're like, it's 2 buildings down from Memorial Union, but there's a big sign outside that says Reed Hall. And 99% of people are probably going to walk by that and say, okay, Red Hall, Reed, they don't realize it's named after someone. And it's something we don't ever really think about, is that all of these buildings are named after people and they mean something. Like Jesse, the Francis Quadrangle, Swallow, Switzler, right? Those are all named after people for different reasons. So do we start pushing for some sort of way for students to know what buildings they're walking by so they realize like what's being represented on campus? Do we make a better Mizzou history website, right? It's kind of just one small step in a broader conversation about this. But it's also recognizing how historians can help universities respond to these things and be on top of them and be part of the conversation about continuing issues and tensions today. So that's where we're at right now.
Okay, so I think what we'll do is we'll go ahead and have our other panelists up, and then we'll do a whole Q&A for everyone. Thank you very much, historians, for this wonderful panel. I think as we thought about the name of our center, right? We deliberated, we thought about it, we were very intentional in calling it the Michael A. Middleton Center for Race, Citizenship, and Justice. A lot went into that. And so what we name things and you know, how we remember them is really important. I also want to say that when we have these kinds of dialogues, as the one that Catherine, Jordan, and Bailey are asking us to have, it's not because these students don't love Mizzou. It's actually that they love it very much, and they want to make sure that we are reflecting on our past, and that we are also thinking about how far we have come. Right, so that's part of it too. All right, so to zoom out a little bit and to think about other ways that our university campus has been a place of belonging, or a place where students have done exactly what these three are doing. I'm going to call up 3 people. The first is Caleb Sewell, who is a senior in the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy Analysis. And Caleb is also a senior in Black Studies and is the current president of the Legion of Black Collegians. So Caleb has a perspective that I think that we need to understand and weave into what the three historians have already shared. And then we have Dr. Mary Beth Brown, who is the endowed Toppan Rare Books curator and librarian at the American Heritage Center at the University of Wyoming. She is, I can talk about Mary Beth for a long time, but she is, I had the pleasure of serving on her dissertation committee when she graduated here with the PhD in history. And her dissertation is titled Beyond the Border War, Students' Civil Rights Activism at the University of Kansas and the University of Missouri from 1946 to 1954. So she can help us think about what it is that students did in the 1940s to make this place a campus where someone like me could come and teach many years later. And then our real guest of honor here is Dr. Julie Middleton. And so I'm going to read a little bit more about Julie. So Dr. Julie Middleton earned a Bachelor of Science in Elementary Education, an educational specialist degree in educational administration, and a Doctor of Philosophy, a PhD in educational administration from the University of Missouri. At the university level, Julie has been a project consultant in the Office of the Vice Provost and assistant to the Dean in the College of Education, and she served as a visiting assistant professor in the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy Analysis. She recently retired. Is that recent? Is it still recent? 6 years ago. So it's not so recent. From the University of Missouri, where she served as Director of Organizational Development and Extension. And she provided statewide leadership for special projects such as improving orientation, professional development, revenue generation, and many other things. What else should I say about Julie? She is also our former First Lady of the University of Missouri system, and helped bring us out of a time of joy, but also a time when the state of Missouri was struggling to come to grips with the very important questions that our students were asking. So the way this is going to go, I would like to have Mary Beth go first to give us the historical perspective. And then Julie, if you would go and talk about your own personal journey here, and then we'll end with a contemporary view from Caleb. So Mary Beth, you go first.
Thank you all, especially for giving me a reason to come back. I've only been gone 6 months, but you know, it's always fun to come home, as they say with homecoming. I'm going to kind of talk, my main research is on African-American history at the University of Missouri, but I've also studied the larger social movements that happen on campus. So I'm going to kind of talk about kind of how that played out, and also really emphasizing the way that students looked to make spaces on campus their own and used activism to do that. So we're going to go through a whole lot of years. I won't give you all the dates, but I have them all written down if anybody wants them later, because there's a lot. Because I don't know if many of you know, especially during fall 2015, one of the biggest things that I always was emphasizing was how long and how much our students have been activists throughout our history, almost from the very beginning. But there are ways and a lot of legacies on campus today still that we have that have come out of this activism. So here we go. Oh, and one thing I wanted to say about a building, y'all can't forget too McReynolds Hall, which is named after Alan McReynolds, who was the president of the board of curators, and he pushed to desegregate the university after seeing what was going on everywhere else and knowing that it was going to come. So he gets overlooked a lot. So not in my dissertation, but he also fought against the KKK, but that was a whole different, that's another history student's, past history student's dissertation. So first we're going to kind of start with the 1930s. And also another thing I always emphasize about Mizzou is how many court cases we've had that have led to significant landmark cases. If I get anything wrong, Professor Mitchell, don't, I'm not a lawyer. So I never try to use the legal terms because I don't know what they mean. So we have, and we're going to look at the Gaines one real quick. We're going to look at Bluford. We're going to look at we're going to mention the Barbara Papish free speech one. And we're also going to mention the one that's not as much well known about, but the fight of LGBTQ students with the Gay Liberation Club. See, I learned things, Dr. Reeder. She was also one of my professors. So we have the application of Lloyd Gaines in the 1930s. And then we also have Bluford, Lucille Bluford. And one of the ways that I think it's important to think of those two is not only are they making space on campus, but just applying to the university is trying to make space for them and making a point that they belong here. So even though neither of them attended, we also had continuously throughout World War II, we had Black men and women continuing to apply to the university. And they wanted to do that to make sure that Mizzou and universities all over the country knew they wanted to go and that they weren't going to let the fight for desegregation die. So I always think that's an important one. I even saw one application once where a young man was wanting to come to be a mortician. And they were just like, yeah, we don't have that program. But I just always still thought that one always sticks out in my mind. So that's something we should remember that often gets overlooked when we're talking about activism. It's kind of a more quiet activism, but it's still activism. So then when we have the campus desegregated in 1950, it's actually a way more complicated story than any of us ever thought. So we have three people. We have Gus Ridgel, who wanted to be a grad student. We had Elmer Bell Jr. and George Horn. They wanted to go to Rolla to be engineers. They were both fresh out of high school. And they were also chosen to be two of the students that sued the university for desegregation. McReynolds helped choose them. So that's something that is really left out of our history. It's in my dissertation and in a chapter that's published as well, just if you want to read more. But I just think it's really important that we don't forget Horn and Bell, because they did a lot, because at the time Rolla wasn't its own campus, it was part of our campus. And they also only were there for a year or two each because of the discrimination they fought there. They decided to come here instead. Unfortunately, neither of those two graduated. So that's why I think we often overlook them, because they're not alums. So, so that's one thing. But then once we have campus desegregated, we have students come in, and then we have more Black students who come in 1954 with Brown versus Board of Education. And we see a lot more undergraduates come. And one of the things, those people who were close to the students would actually spread out and work, especially in the pre-Brown years. Now, I focus on the pre-Brown years. I do 46 through 54. It's different than it is in the 1960s and the 1970s on campus. It's very, very different. But we have people like SGA President Winston Martin, who he wanted to room with Ridgel, but his dad was kind of a big businessman, and he was like, no, you're not going to do it. It's going to tick too many people off. So he backed down from rooming with Gus Ridgel. But he also used his position in campus government to help push businesses near campus to desegregate. And then we also had the formation of the first Coed chapter here on campus in the early 1950s. And they worked throughout town to do movie theater protests, restaurant sit-ins, lunch counter sit-ins, and try to make campus and the local community better spaces for Black students. We also have the many social movements during the 1960s. We have the fight for rights to ensure that campus spaces were accessible, but they also, a lot of students pushed for more Black faculty, staff, and other Black students. And that continued on through the 80s, 90s, and even today. We also got censured for that by the AAUP. Is that who said? Yeah, we got censured for that too. So that's a whole nother one though. LBC was very significant, and I'm going to let Caleb talk more about LBC. They were very significant in leading the movement for change, and they also paved the way or showed other groups a way forward. So they not only made the campus better for themselves, but they also made it better for other groups on campus. So we're going to kind of flip now. Oh, and then legacies. I like to talk, everybody's like, what comes out of these social movements? Well, with LBC's demands, we got the addition of additional campus spaces, and they changed the campus environment. We had the Black Culture House, which had different iterations, and then also the Black Studies program. And then we see other significant and still present changes to the campus curriculum that are put in place years following. We have women and gender studies classes that start getting added. Then we have, and I also teach one of those in the summer if anybody wants to know more. We also have peace studies, and we see a lot of expanded curriculum that offers more options for the campus community, but also provides classes where Black students, students of color, and women are represented. And the focus is not on traditional topics, white men history, but expanded the viewpoint and perspectives available for students. And then going along with our discussion at Reed Hall, we have women's movements on campus. We have women students in the late 19th and early 20th century who had restrictions on their clothing they could wear that were different than male students. And they pushed back on that. It might've been small little pushbacks, but they wrote about it and put it in their diaries and then donated those diaries to archives so we can read about it now and we can see how restrictive these policies and these rules were. Then we have, they also pointed out discrepancies, especially when it came to differences in campus spaces like gymnasiums. They really pushed for their own gym and their own space, and they got the 4th floor of Jesse Hall for part of it. And they would shoot rifles up there if anybody ever wants to. There's some very fun stories with that. They also later, especially in the 1960s, they pushed back against more dress codes and also against in loco parentis policies, where the university acted as the parent or the guardian for the all students, but it was mostly enforced on women students. And then they also wanted to seek more independence from campus rules, which unfairly discriminated against them. Like they had key rules where they couldn't leave the dorm after a certain time or get back in without getting negative hours, I think is the term they used. And also there was another student who's a postdoc now who did a dissertation on that. So if anybody's interested in the key rules and things like that, I can give you some good things, good recommendations. And they lived in Gentry Hall at the time. They also fought against students fought against the inequality and the rights of not only students, but the larger community. Because if there's injustice in the surrounding communities, how's the campus supposed to feel like home? So we see, again, lots of protests in the early 50s and then in the late 50s through the 60s to desegregate places in Columbia. Some had success, some didn't. There are still places I can't go into in town just because I know the history too much. And I just can't. So then we have LGBTQ rights. There was a student org, and I have good dates on this one. It was the Gay Lib Student Group is what it was called. And they wanted to be, and they were doing this all around the country, testing universities to see if they would get recognized. Because if you were recognized as a student org, you got money. And you had places on campus that you could have activities, and it wasn't beneficial for your student group if you weren't recognized as an org. And I think it's still that way a lot today. So in 1971, they start trying to get university recognition. In December of that year, they're actually approved by the student faculty committee, and then it's overturned by the dean of students. And then in February 1973, the leader of the group meets with the chancellor, and again, they get turned down. So that's 2 years so far. Then in November 73, the curators turn them down because they kept appealing up to get recognition, and they kept saying no. So they take them to court. And in 1976, there's a decision in favor of MU saying it's okay for you to deny them rights or the rights of a student org. But they go and appeal. And in 1977, the US Court of Appeals, so the big ones, overturned the decision that was in MU's favor, and MU wasn't happy. So they decided they wanted to take it to the Supreme Court. And it goes to the Supreme Court to hear if they're gonna hear it, and it fails by 1 vote. So it's upheld that they have to recognize the student org. And that's one that I think that we don't talk enough about. So if anybody needs a dissertation topic, I can't do it, somebody else can do it. So we keep seeing this continued fight by especially LBC and Black students for more representation on campus. And then we kind of hop to the 1980s when we have the divestment movement on campus. And that kind of starts in the 1970s, and it's very, very similar to things going on in the world today. The students wanted the university to divest their retirement and pension funds from apartheid from South Africa. because they supported apartheid. So the students went and said, we want you to take the money out because a lot of other places were doing this. The university said, well, think about it. And then 7 years later, they formed a task force. Then the next year, the students had said that they were ready to push a little harder. So they built a shanty town in the middle of Jesse Quad or Francis Quad. And then in October, they arrested 17 of the students. And the chancellor at the time, Barbara Ewing, agreed to let it stay until January 1987. But then in February, her replacement said, no, it's going to go. And they rebuilt it. Every time they would tear it down, they would rebuild it. And in February, 41 protesters were arrested. Finally, by August 1987, the state of Missouri divested. And then they said to the university, it's your turn. The university decided to divest in 1988, but it took until I think it was 1993 to totally divest. So that's a 20-year process. Just in case you think they're all over very fast. So it did make changes in the campus environment. I kick myself to this day because I did not save where I saw it, but it resulted in the creation of Speaker Circle, because they didn't want students protesting in Francis Quad because that's the pretty place on campus. So we see even today, up till fall 2015, when we had the talk about where students could protest, we see the campus physical environment still being contested. And we saw student protests where we see and watch how students were reclaiming campus spaces for their home to kind of represent their home. And I probably went over and I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you so much for having me here today to talk a little bit about my experiences here at Mizzou. So let me just start by saying that University of Missouri means a great deal to me and my family. My husband and I actually met at the University of Missouri, and 2 of our 3 children went to the University of Missouri. So the university has had a great impact on my life. A lot of what you have talked about has just, I don't know, it's all come home for me as I'm listening here to you. My husband and I have served in multiple roles, and Dr. Shonican mentioned a number of the roles in which I've served and in which he has served as well. The final role that I served was Director of Organizational Development at Extension. And I don't know how many of you know of Extension. Raise your hand if you've heard of Extension. Okay, great. Extension is actually the outreach function of the university, and it takes the university resources and programs from all 4 campuses into the communities. So we actually serve the entire state and 114 counties. So all of these experiences that I've had at the university as a student and as a professor and as a director of multiple programs, they've really impacted my perspective and certainly my sense of identity and my sense of belonging here at MU. You know, interestingly enough, I really feel like I always belonged at Mizzou. There really wasn't a time that I didn't feel that I belonged. And maybe my feeling of belonging wasn't shared by others with whom I dealt. But I attribute this feeling to the strong sense of self-esteem that I had. I actually attended segregated schools, elementary school and high school. And I actually graduated 3rd out of 500 students at Beaumont High in St. Louis. I actually tested out of math, I tested out of sciences and foreign language at the university. So I didn't have to take those classes when I first came. So I actually felt very well prepared, and I really felt like I belonged here, and I felt that I would be successful. So it was surprising to me, and this was 1967, when I arrived on campus, and I was assigned a roommate, and my roommate came in and she looked at me rather strangely, and she began asking me a lot of questions about my race and about the color of my skin. And was I this color all the time? Did I have a tan, or did this wash off? She asked me about my hair. I was beginning to comb my hair, getting ready for bed. And she asked me, how could I get the comb through my hair and all of this. And, you know, it was surprising to me, and it was a little annoying, but I thought, well, I can educate her about all of this. Well, after 2 days, she left the campus, and she cited the idea that she just could not live with a Black girl. And so, I was really hurt about this because I had all of these ideas about what a wonderful experience I was going to have and how the roommates, we were going to be best friends and all of that. And I had to live alone my first year at the University of Missouri. Now, interestingly enough, I did not generalize her behavior. I kind of felt that maybe she was one off. I went to class and as I said, I thought I was well prepared, but I received my first writing assignment back and I had a C. Well, I was an outstanding student in high school, so this surprised me. And so I went up to the university professor to say, why did I get a C? And of course, this was all a subjective grading system. And he said, you should be happy. You got a C. What are you expecting here? And I told him of my expectations. I said, I expect to get an A in this class. And he was really surprised. And I will say that after that, I really didn't get any other C's in that class when it was subjective. So certainly there were other experiences, but with limited time, I won't go into all of them. But I didn't let these experiences impact my sense of belonging or my sense of identity or my sense of self. And at the tender age of 17 years old, you can imagine that you might have been impacted very negatively by these. But as a matter of fact, when I graduated, I ended up being selected as one of the top 10 Coeds. And I think this was something they were doing for 17 magazine, and we were actually in that magazine. And so that was very positive. And I was also selected to be an RA in charge of McReynolds Hall, the 8th floor. So I had some very wonderful experiences, very positive experiences, but I also had those other experiences. Now, fast forward, 20 years later, I come back to the University of Missouri, and this time I am wanting to get into the PhD program in educational administration. I brought my transcript where I had a 4.0 from an HBCU from Jackson State. The department chair said, oh yes, I see that you have a 4.0, but that really doesn't mean 4.0 here at the University of Missouri. I'm not so sure that you can really handle this curriculum here. Those schools are really kind of different. And so at that time, I presented my transcript from Mizzou, where I had an almost 4.0. And then he said, oh, okay, well, then that's different. So go ahead and apply to the program. So that was it, even though this person was a barrier to me at the beginning, he actually ended up being one of my greatest advocates after I got into the program and he got to know me. And I was actually awarded the Departmental Outstanding Graduate Student Award, and I also received the Superior Graduate Teaching Award. So that was very exciting to me. Now, later on, maybe another 10 years, I came back to be an assistant professor. And I was in the College of Education, and we were in a meeting trying to decide how we were going to restructure the College of Education. I came up with an idea, and the scribe and the facilitator looked and nodded his head, but he didn't really write anything on the notepad that he was keeping up front. The next person had another idea, and 2 or 3 people spoke. And then probably the 5th person came around and he said something, and the facilitator said, this is the kind of thinking we need here. This is the direction we're going to go. This is outstanding. And everybody looked around and said, great idea, Joe. And then one very brave professor stood up. He was actually an assistant professor and said, I thought that was an excellent idea 15 minutes ago when Julie Middleton said it. So everyone looked surprised, but actually this sense of anonymity where someone is, sometimes people are not seen or they're not heard because of their color or because of being a woman. You know, I'm not sure exactly what was at play that day, but I'm certainly eternally grateful to the ally who courageously came forward and stood up to his colleagues. Now, the history of our university is undeniable. There certainly has been discrimination on many levels throughout the years, but I really truly believe that the university is a good place. And I believe that those who are in roles of responsibility really do try to provide equitable experiences and treatment to all students. But I believe that as long as the university is a microcosm of our society, you are going to have discrimination and you are going to have racism, because some people have developed stereotypes along the way and they don't really see value in people that do not look like them. I really believe that if you can get a chance to meet people at a personal level, and if we can begin to know each other and not make decisions about people based on the color of their skin, then we can go a long way. However, I think it's also important that we look at the systems that are at play here, because there are a lot of systems that help not level the playing field. And so one of the things that I did at the University of Missouri Extension was to work at a system level, trying to change the systems of recruiting and attracting and hiring and promoting faculty, and so that people weren't inadvertently discriminated against. I actually established a reporting system so that our 1,200 extension employees, as they were working in the community, they made sure that they were serving the entire community. So if you had 11% minority in your county, but you were serving only 2%, you needed to strategize about how you were going to do better. And so I think this made a big difference. We actually had a strategic plan for diversity that worked very well. Secondly, we started what we called an extension-wide, and actually the university got involved in this as well, a civility campaign where everybody worked on creating an environment that was inclusive and welcoming and showing respect to everyone. So we had a saying, value inclusivity and choose civility, because that is a choice. And so finally, it was my honor and my joy to serve as First Lady. And it really seemed as though I had gone full circle. And to actually be an inhabitant of the home that actually represented the university, and that was Providence Point. And one of the very first things that Mike and I did is we went in there and we had them take down all of the pictures of slaveholders from Providence Point. And we replaced those with artwork from diverse audiences. The next thing that happened, Mike was appointed November 9th. And so Thanksgiving was the next holiday that came up. And so we invited our entire family out. We had 48 extended family members for dinner at Providence Point. And I'm telling you, we had a traditional soul food meal from the collard greens all the way to the sweet potato pie right there in Providence Point. And so the 7 grandchildren filled the place, and they ran up and down the ramp of that 13,000 square foot home, and they called it Poppy's Palace. And so as I looked at them, I really hoped that this would be something that would live on in their hearts and in their minds, and that they would always feel that they belonged, you know, at this university. My personal goal as First Lady was to bring the entire community into the university. And so in planning any of the activities or events or programs, I always made sure that we had diverse audiences. And people often commented, we've never seen this many African Americans at this event, and that kind of thing. But I also worked to empower women and minority students as I spoke on campus throughout the years. I believe that we've made great strides at the university in terms of having a more respectful culture and a better campus climate. And so my message to minority students is to voice your concerns. This is important. And of course, this is what happened in 2015. And I'm very proud of those students that they had the courage to speak up. You need to bring an attitude that you belong here and you have to expect to succeed. My message to the entire community is to think about what an inclusive environment centered on diversity and equity, what that can really look like. and how we can have a climate that is inclusive and welcoming and respectful of everyone on this campus, no matter your race, your ethnicity, or your background. And Mike always, my husband, also challenged people on each of the 4 campuses to think about what an inclusive university would look like. Just imagine, what that university would look like. And once we all imagine that, then only then can we actually achieve that goal. But I really feel that it's important for each of us to know that it is not the responsibility of one person or 2. It is the responsibility of all of us to make this happen. And this way, everyone on this campus can have a strong sense of identity, and they can have a strong sense of belonging in this space.
Woo! I was planning on starting this another way, but then like hearing everybody's points here, like I feel like called to say some stuff, and even on here. And so Dr. Shonkin, you started off by saying, like these students love Mizzou, right? And that's why they critique it. And I know my experience, I don't love Mizzou for what it is. I love it for what it can be. And I want to create space for those, whether they're students, faculty, community members, right? To have space to critique a place that you may not love right now. I think that's the work. Like it shouldn't just be people who love a place to critique it, but even if you don't love it, because that's a valid experience. And that's what I think belonging also looks like too. And because also I know we are at a research one institution, I had to bring some scholarship also because my professors, Dr. Carney, Dr. Shonkin, I had to, right? Extra credit for me. And so one of those things, right, when we're talking about belonging, school belonging in research, it says that it's defined as perceptions of acceptance, respect, inclusion, and support, right? And then of course we know students who perceive a sense of school belonging generally fare both academically and psychologically. And then we also know too, as I'm president of Black Student Government, I'm also a Black student, Black Americans are at higher risk of receiving disconforming messages about whether they fit within academic spaces. And so another thing, it's gonna be a little hot take here too, is that I think when we talk about belonging, and when we think about like equity with belonging, people are not gonna belong in that vision. People are not going to belong in a space that makes people feel like they belong, right? And I think that's kind of the history of the university too, is like, who are we saying belongs here? Or what messages are people perceiving that we're telling don't belong here, right? And so as a student, I mean, people talk about the history already, and so I don't want to go too much into that, right? But I know as student leaders and people in these spaces, we experience so many different messages and receive so many different messages. And I think one thing I want to say that I learned from Dr. Tia McNair is that we can't have just an equity talk, but an equity walk. And I think oftentimes in so many different spaces, even as I was talking to this panel, right, we say buzzwords like equity, inclusion, diversity. But if we're really not walking that out in practice, the talk doesn't really mean that much. And so it's beautiful to say equity, right? I believe in equity, but if we're not walking into that, then it doesn't mean that much. And I think that's what we're seeing in so many different spaces. I remember this summer 2020, a lot of us remember that was summer we saw George Floyd, Breonna Taylor. We saw uprisings around the country. We also saw students here at the university protesting, resisting white supremacy too, in that legacy. And I remember I was in a meeting with administrators and curators during that time. And one curator was talking about systemic racism and what that means for us at a university and the institutional level and how that impacts students' and sense of belonging. And one curator told me, he said, Caleb, systemic racism doesn't exist. And if you just said that, you're just trying to pin a dark light on the university, right? And so what does that mean for belonging? And what message does that send for who belongs? And also that was a Black person too, right? And so I'm even calling this right here in this space to not just talk about representation. And we're talking about LBC, we're talking about how much we did for representation and what it means for us to have Black people in these different spaces, Black students in these different spaces. But what LBC and our vision now today is moving past representation and getting to transformation. And that is deeper than just representation, right? And so for belonging, what that message sends to us in belonging, we need people at these high levels telling students, telling faculty, telling administrators that work that they're doing is not real, that they're not experiencing these systemic barriers. What does that mean for belonging? But also what does it mean at a campus, at the institutional level, right, that has scholarship here, that centers on equity, diversity, and inclusion? What does it mean here when we have administrators who are in spaces that are advocating for, or should be advocating for at least inclusion, diversity, and equity, right? When you have somebody at that high level saying that those things, that work doesn't exist, that the work doesn't, it isn't important, doesn't matter. So it's not only talking about student and belonging, but also faculty and staff belonging. And as a student here too, we see over time, key marginalized faculty and staff who are here for some years and end up getting pushed out, right? And so what does that mean for belonging too? If students don't see their faculty even feeling like they belong or being pushed out when they belong. Thankfully, we have Darshana back here today, right? But like that doesn't happen for everybody, right? And so what message does it send when we have Black faculty getting pushed out, Black staff, and then now Black students who also see that and know that they don't belong either? Messages that send. And I also want to say too, when we talk about belonging, belonging personally for me, it hasn't impacted my self-esteem, right? And knowing who I am, but it has impacted my mental health. Because when you're at an institutional space and you're advocating and fighting for equity and justice, not just in conversation, but also in your walk, right? It's burdensome when you have people who are telling you your work doesn't matter. When you're experiencing people in different spaces, canceling out your work. We're talking about history. And a lot of staff and faculty and even student leaders, including myself, were on this thing at the university called a history committee, a history walk. And what that was supposed to do was it was supposed to try to create campus spaces and show a true reflection on its history of the university in different institutional spaces and different infrastructural spaces. And we have people working on that for years. And then it gets to the board of curators and they turn it down, right? And so what does it mean for even when we're trying to be honest with our history, that the institutional space is saying that doesn't matter and that work doesn't belong here, that honest history doesn't belong here. What message is that sending to us? And so I think too, it's just about being honest where we're at. I think oftentimes in equity work, especially when it comes to marginalized people, we are told that to be honest, our honesty is just pessimism, and we're too pessimistic. But truthfully, our honesty and truthfulness is rooted in love and justice. And if people move past are able to see that the work can actually be changed and spaces can be transformed. And so one thing that's what I think about oftentimes, and being a student here, and thankfully being shown justice and love through different faculty and staff and even other students too is, and also I'm coming from a faith tradition that says the truth will set us free, right? And so I think one thing I oftentimes think about is our silence cannot be bought, right? But also what does it mean for our silence to be bought in these different spaces and places? And being at the institution as well too. Oftentimes you're told messages like, well, racism is everywhere, so why does it matter? Like, don't worry about it, it's everywhere. But what does that message send to us, right? That says, don't worry about it. Don't worry about transforming spaces or equity because it's everywhere, and that's the wrong message to send. But to also believe that because racism is everywhere, that we therefore shouldn't be working towards those things of equity and inclusion, right? That means we're buying a lie. And when I say buying a lie, I don't mean somebody lying and saying, just like I was told, racism doesn't exist, but also lying means lying to ourselves and withholding the truth about our own experiences as people at this institution, as people in different spaces in America, right? When we're in different meetings, if we're not being honest about our experience and how we're experiencing marginalization, we therefore are buying a lie. And that's not good, and that's not healthy for us. Even thinking about our history at institutional space as Black people, as marginalized folk, right? I even think about, I think about how, we resist, and also sometimes we believe we're taught that assimilation is the safest aspect to go, right? And to assimilate into different white spaces, into conversations, right? Just be at the table, we should be thankful, right? And that's enough. But truthfully, again, assimilation is not enough for us, and we need to have transformed spaces. We need equity to be achieved, and equity is not through assimilation. And assimilation sometimes, unfortunately, is buying that lie with the ones to believe that our work doesn't matter, and that again, justice and justice and equity cannot be achieved in a certain extent. And so I think that's kind of what we've seen in different spaces, even with you're talking about the social justice centers, right? And how that was a movement for marginalized students and Black students, right? I think about spaces like the Legion of Black Collegians Center, the Women's Center, LGBTQ Resource Center, right? And even recently, we've seen a restructure of that department and those centers and spaces. And I think when we talk about belonging again, what does it mean that these spaces that were advocated for and pushed for by students that are experiencing these things, these students were not included in the process of restructuring those spaces and places? What does it mean that when students are advocating for these centers, for these safe havens to exist, right? Where they're no longer included in those processes of those changes. What message does that send too? And so I think that's even, we're thinking about equity, right? What does that look like to actually include stakeholders and value student stakeholders and staff stakeholders and faculty stakeholders in that process? And so we're dealing with a lot. We're dealing with, of course, systemic racism. We're also dealing with capitalism. We're dealing with, again, so many different messages that were being told. But again, when it comes to belonging, we have to be honest about our own experiences. We have to be truthful. And even when we're out of space where it may seem we have mixed messages, where we're walking past the Guns and Black Collegians Center or Brooks Hall, right? But then we're also walking by a Thomas Jefferson statue and then a Thomas Jefferson tombstone that has more surveillance and protection than a lot of people on campus, right? What message does that send us to when it comes to belonging? And so I think, again, it's to be honest about those things and to be truthful, and to also know that, again, to be truthful is not pessimistic, but it's rooted in love and justice. And that's the work that we're doing today with LBC.
All right, so introducing right now my
Thank you.
co-director,
Thank
Dr.
you.
David Mitchell, who is the Blue Holston professor of law and does a lot of research on incarceration and reentry after incarceration. So I won't go into all his accolades. I'll just have him step up and moderate the conversation.
Oh, thank you very much. Can everybody hear me? This good. It's working great. This is fantastic. I think this is what we envisioned with the Middleton Center. So another round for our panelists, please. This is great. And so I'm going to start with this first question, then we're going to get audience questions and questions from Zoom too, and we'll see how this works. I feel like for you older people, Merv Griffin, for you younger folks, Ricky Lake, and for you younger folks, some kind of blog. Anyway, so my first comment, I'm going to take moderator privilege. My first comment and question is this. So I went to a University East Coast, and we had a Pembroke, we had a female college that they subsumed, right? But there was also in our dining hall, there was a place where all the Black students sat, and it was affectionately labeled LA, Little Africa. And I became a resident advisor, and we said, oh, there was people wanted to talk about that, right? The diversity aspect. So someone say, why is it that all the Black students sit in LA? His brother got up and said, that's a great question. But how come no one asks, how come all the white students sit in big Europe around LA, right? Or why is it that no one talks about the Greek corner, right? Or why is it that no one identifies those spaces as being fundamentally different? And so the question I would throw out there is, are there spaces on this campus that are reaffirming or affirming of identity and senses of belonging, and places on this campus where it is really challenging to have your identity in its authenticity, and where you don't feel as though you belong, where you may avoid because it rejects your presence fundamentally?
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. My right privilege. It's beautiful, beautiful. But I would say, yeah, definitely, right? And so, as students, what we hear from different students and constituents, right, is that sometimes when you're visiting certain office hours or professors, those are some spaces where you feel like you belong, right? So let's say, for example, if I'm going to Dr. Christina Carney's office, right, I may feel in that space like I belong and I'm being affirmed in my values, or Dr. Shonkin, right? But then there's some office areas and office spaces, right, where you're getting told that message of you don't belong, or right? Like you're getting a C, you're like, I don't deserve this C, and they're not reaffirming that you do deserve that grade, right? And so there definitely are spaces. And also I call it institutional trauma. And I call that because there's certain spaces on campus where you are not being affirmed in who you are, in justice and in love. And you're being told those signals that you shouldn't be here, but also like they shouldn't be here, but that again, the work you're doing doesn't matter, the research you're engaging in doesn't matter, and then the people that you care so much about don't matter either. And so there are spaces like that on campus that different students experience of both, and or both. But again, we also know it's institutional. And so again, although there's spaces on campus that we may be affirmed in, we know at any moment institutionally it could change. Where that's the people being pushed out, where the faculty are not coming back, staff are not being able to return, or even campus center spaces not returning the same way as a safe haven as they were in the previous semester. So yes, definitely we're seeing both of those sides of things. I don't know if y'all want to speak on that too.
Yeah, I would also say like ownership and I think your ability to like mold the university around you. So I, will just through the nature of my job with ASEM, watch board of curators meetings. And where is the space at for students? Our representative to the board that is expected to give like activities updates and programming updates for students and not like talk, seriously and have intentional conversations about like what do students want, what do they need, and have that be a space where like actual, change is made or voices are being actually heard, and then plans are therefore, implemented. And they're not spaces constructed for students whatsoever, and it very much like reinforces this idea that we are like a transient population. We are meant to just like leave the university and not have this space that we belong in be a space that we can mold. It's a space that we are meant to step into and then be pushed out of. And it's not, for us, we aren't allowed to build it and to shape it and to have it be, what we want it to be, what it should be for students who are, populating it, funding it, and things like that.
Departmental.
Yeah.
Can I add something, one more thing too? So also in I think about scholarship and also the country as well too. And when we had Barack Obama as president, right, there was this thing called, we're living in a post-racial society now, right? And things are better. Woo, we got it. And I think at Mizzou, at 2015, we had like Dr. Middleton, right, as president. People were like, oh, whoa, Mizzou's post-racial now. We're in this post-racial Mizzou, we're doing things. Yes, Black people, woo, we're here, right? But we realize again, is like, that's not true. We're still living in a space, institutional space that doesn't value marginalized folk, right? And that value gap of who belongs and whose value is still there and prevalent. And so I think too, that's what we also got to think about too, is like, when we're seeing those things, people still believe that lie that we're in a post-racial place now, Mizzou's doing good, woo-woo. When really, there's so many different places that are not transformed yet.
Yeah, speaking of the last board of curators meeting, the centering of rurality, rather than like rurality in IDE rather than like Black students. That was like 15-minute topic of conversation. Yeah.
Any others on that one, or? Okay, good. All right, I'm sorry. I can ask questions all
You
day.
got one.
Question from the, okay, I'm really old. I just did the old thing. I just didn't want to be like, all right, let me see. I got this. Okay. I'm not sure where it ended, but in addition to advocating for the naming of Brooks and Bluford Halls, I tried to make sure that there was some sort of official maker or plaque acknowledging who these people were and how they advocated for inclusion at MU, and I left before any that may have happened. This is from our former colleague, Frankie Miner. So the folks know sort of where we are in that process of naming spaces, right?
I mean, that was something I was going to mention, is that the difference between the past and the history, right? There's a ton of street names or parts of the city and the campus or statues to people like Rollins, who like part of the university campus was built on a plantation, and freshman students come in every single year and don't know that, and they're shocked by it. So it goes back to the historical literacy, I think. But in terms of the plaques and the naming, that seems to be a solution for a lot of what we bring up with Reed Hall, is like, why don't we just put a statue or a memorial to Daniel Reed somewhere? Like, it's not about him specifically, right? It's something bigger than that. But it's also the fact that those parts of the past that are not in the curated history of the university are not represented on campus. And so we don't see much to Bluford or Gaines or Ridgel or anyone else for students to walk by, even if they're going to ignore it, right? There's a ton of plaques and things that, I mean, this is a whole public history matter that we could get into, how to best engage people. But even if students walk by it and only read it once for the 4 years they're here, the 5 years they're here, right? Or 8 like me, it's my 3 degrees. Even if you read it once, right? It's meaningful to know that it's there, that it's being remembered, that it has a place on campus. And I think it speaks louder to never see something like that on campus in the first place. It's one of those cases where the silence speaks louder. And I mean, we know the lynching memorial over on the MKT trail is constantly vandalized or taken down. And that was a university employee, right? That's something that matters to the university. And I wonder if that's part of the conversation of, well, if we put other things up, do people worry that those will get vandalized and it just becomes some sort of burden, which like that comes with it, right? Like we have to keep working. It's part of what we keep working towards. But in terms of finding memorials and statues and naming other things for marginalized people on campus, I mean, I think we feel a little shot down with the things that the Board of Curators continuously shoot down in terms of representing people on campus. So.
Okay,
Oh, Dr. Brown.
I helped name, first of all, I helped name Brooks Hall. So it is a very long process, but, and I also helped with the markers in town, the sharpened heritage markers. So I have experience with this stuff. I think the biggest question is who's gonna write the text? Because
Yeah.
you
Oh, yeah,
have, I
that's
mean,
true.
if you've ever tried to write anything in a group, it's never an easy process. So if you have the people writing it and they aren't invested and they don't know the history, then that's going to lead to problems. And third thing, every freshman needs to take a history class on the history of the university, even if it's just a one credit, even if it's just a 1 credit hour
Yeah.
class.
But who's teaching it though?
So
Okay, there you go, there you go.
Well, I mean, look, I think you just talked about the 1839 project, right? I mean, this sounds like this is the Mizzou project. I mean, fundamentally,
yeah.
and there's a lot of things that you just mentioned today that I think I had no idea about. And I think I need to propose a legal cases, a Mizzou legal cases course over at the law school, because there's a whole lot of them, right?
It would be so, and that's only half of the half of the
Exactly,
cases. So,
exactly.
yeah.
Nope.
Yeah, I just think that I mean, most people on campus don't know the history.
Dr. Mills.
I think these plaques would be really important because you're right, people don't really know the history. And, you know, the naming of the buildings, actually, you said there were 4 buildings that were named for
So far,
African Americans so far. I mean, I like to see that we have at least named some at this point, because in 1967, when I was here, we didn't have any. We didn't have the Black Culture Center, you know, even. And we certainly didn't have any buildings named for anyone. And so later on, all of this occurred. So I'm happy to see some of this happening, having spaces for people, for the gay and gender center there and those kinds of things. But I'm also disheartened to learn that some of these spaces are maybe being compromised at this time. So I think we have to look at the big picture, but I think we all have to work together to continue to put pressure on those that be, so that we can continue to have more buildings named by others, and then the plaques to actually talk about what they represent.
And I will say,
I was just gonna say, we also have a building named after a Japanese American that it kind of gets overlooked in alcohol sometimes.
Very good.
I will say that other universities, as like Jordan was talking about, have, you know, created effective and operational commissions to grapple with their history and to actually like go through the process of renaming buildings that are named after men and like historical figures who have done like terrible things and need not to be memorialized in that way.
and I think as a final closing on this one, maybe, I think there's a huge like misunderstanding that like students don't want to know this history or don't care about it. But our experience, I mean, like I know Bailey because I had her as a freshman when I was like running a residential college. When students find this information out, they want to know more, like they want to take the class on it, right? And I think there's a broader either like administrative level or a state level and like definitely a national level right now that students don't want to know this history or they shouldn't know this history, right? And so having a University of Missouri history class, I think, again, these are just like small steps in all of this, but it could be something that opens up students' eyes, like the campus they actually live and operate on every single day and have them like think about their home more.
I think it's a big process.
And peace studies.
Are there any questions from the audience?
I kind of want to follow up on it. Exactly, what would it take to get this class going and just do it instead of talking about it? We've got all these scholars who have put this, we put the idea of making a 3-hour class. It would be under history, it could be cross-listed. Why don't we just do it? I mean, if it gets shut down, it gets shut down, but instead of it gets shut down if it don't get proposed. So why don't we just do it?
I mean, I like that. I mean, actually, I have no problem with that. I mean, and I think it's a good idea, right? I was gonna ask a follow-up, but go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say that
I'm sorry, hang on a second. I'm really Merv Griffin now.
our institutional partner, Kinder, does have classes, right? Does offer degrees and so on. The Middleton Center up to this point, we're very young, we're just a year old, but our vision is to have some courses that we run through the Middleton Center. And this would be a wonderful one. This would be a great start. So I think I know him. We're already thinking this, this is an excellent idea, and we might then take all of you and start thinking about what a class like that might look like. And with history and Black studies and women and gender studies, what if we created that course and it was mandatory?
Mhm.
All students.
We
Or
could do
like
that.
then
So,
online training about other things that we take online trainings about.
well, no, we gotta do something. We gotta do something a little bit better than that. No, we can't do that. So I was gonna ask this though, right? So we can put up a plaque, but we're about to demolish a building that represents so much more than just, I mean, first of all, it represents a historical architectural piece and where women sort of first had their dorms, right? I mean, and so we're removing that. And so it's erasing history, making it invisible. I mean, the question then is, are plaques enough in order to constitute a sense of belonging, right? It's very easy to put something on the wall to say, yes, this was here. It's more in terms of creating a space of belonging and where you feel as though this is home, right? Is this really enough?
I mean, yeah, just kind of, there's a lot to unpack there, so thank you. One of the first things, especially, so Reed Hall, it was announced it was going to be demolished the 4th of March last year, so it's been over a year now.
No, you keep talking.
Okay. So one thing I kind of regret about how we've approached this is we met with administrators immediately, which is good because you need to put that worm in the ear. But now we've spent a year detailed researching, archiving everything. That
We have a good case.
We have a good case. And one of the first things that was said to us was well, if it means so much to you girls,
Or we were called history buffs.
we were called history buffs. Well, if it means so much to you girls, maybe we can put a plaque to Daniel Reed, or you guys can create a plaque to the building and it can stand out there. And I'm like, okay, and in the back of our minds, we're like, okay, but there's still going to be a big hole behind the plaque. So maybe that's a more memorial in and of itself. Yeah, there's my plaque. But I guess it's a start. Obviously, not destroying the building would be step one. But also I think, again, the reason we really zeroed in on Reed Hall is it is, a symptom of many much larger problems. And one of them is kind of to Jordan was alluding to is students care about this. There's a massive fallacy that students do not care. Jordan and I teach our TA for 1,000 level history classes. So that is just anyone is thrown in there. None of my students right now are history majors, bless their souls. And yet they're engaged and they're intrigued. When I was a freshman, I lived in Defoe Graham. And I remember waiting for my to pick up my parcel in the lobby. And there was a plaque to Defoe and to Graham. And I sat there and read it. So it's yeah, students will care about it. I think at the very least, they have to engage it because they're bored and their phone is dead, and again, just for the very, very real fact that they are occupying this space. One thing that we've also been looking into is Missouri S&T is that is what it's called, right?
Yeah.
For some reason I was MIT. Missouri S&T is confronting this space problem right now. A lot of what they're trying to do is turn off the microphone. Their campus is ugly. And they're trying, and I'm getting to the point, and they aren't retaining students. Jordan and I graduated from this university and are sticking around because we like it here, despite what it might seem. And so there's this very real task that the university system is confronting with now, is that how do you make your campus appealing? And step one is to preserving the spaces that students come home. Last October during homecoming, of course, all of us know what that looks like on this campus. But in the tweet storms that the university official page sends out, one of the photos included women sitting on a float going past Reed Hall in the background. So they don't even know. It's like, so there's a disconnect there. And so what we've been trying to do is just like force that connection there. And through using plaques, I think is at least a good start to starting those connections.
I will say that they can often be like weaponized and tokenized as like, because we don't want to take any more substantive action, we're just going to throw a plaque on it. I think we've definitely seen that happen with the Jefferson statue.
It's one step, right? But the bigger action, like Caleb was talking about, is working culturally to reset everything in education. And that's where classes like this come in, and actually historical literacy and understanding what these spaces mean and who they represent, right? So plaques can be weaponized, but they can also be very good. They can be both be problematic, but also very useful at the same time. But they're not the solution. They're one thing we can do. They seem like a safe option a lot of times, but I think the bigger thing is educating students and giving them the opportunity and trusting them to learn this history so that they walk around campus and maybe don't need plaques to know what they're walking by.
Yeah. I say plaques, buildings, statues, they're more fruits than roots. So they deal with the fruits. They show something, right?
Yeah.
But the roots are still there. And so what are the roots that we have to deal with to get that good fruit or produce that good fruit?
Well, and that's kind of my question is, how are these recreations of spaces? Because that is what the plaques do. I remember when there was a portrait of Captain Jack over Black Jack in the Union, and Black Jack was one of the leaders of the criminalization of homosexuals on campus and would send them over to the psych department and send them away. And for years, he just sat in the lobby up there over the students. And it took the students, well, it took a historian who did a course and walking around and doing Missouri, it was not me. To see that, and the students organized and got that up. They changed the name of the student center, which also. So, and my point here is that these plaques, the portraits, the art, yes, they're on one hand superficial, they're also integral in constructing the space. And I think that's like arguably perhaps where the transformative can come. And I don't know, like I hear what you're saying about how, I think that is brilliant. Like we need to transform. How exactly do we do that? Through an intersectional process, because that is also what I'm hearing here. And is there a way to anchor it in space, in the actual reclaiming or claiming of space, and to think hard about how we can do that as historians and activists? So there's my call, is let's figure out how to do this. They'll help.
I've got a couple online, there are a couple online questions, so.
Maybe last question.
Okay. Well, okay, I'm gonna throw them both out there. And so some buildings on the MU campus are on the historic registry. Is Reed Hall on the historic registry?
No.
Okay, that's an easy one, you're right.
Yeah.
Can we advocate for a bigger presence of our history on more obvious, prominent web spaces? One can find our history if one searches, but we don't provide it openly, in my humble opinion. Can the panelist audience speak to this? Our main Mizzou page ignores our history. And I will just add one other thing in there, because that's sort of how I am. There's belonging that is belonging in physical spaces and belonging that is belonging in emotional spaces in this place, right? And sometimes they are combined. I mean, I walked into a building that didn't let Lloyd Gaines in, right? There's finally a photo of one Black faculty member, and that happened to be Mike Middleton on the walls, right? And, down a hallway full of other white people. So, so speaking on this notion of both physical and this, and as well as can we have a more prominent place for our history, and talking about this belonging in the context, not just of physical belonging in this space, but the other piece that comes with it that we often don't really talk about, but we sort of experience.
So I mean, we need to point out that we missed some crucial details. We didn't mention that Reed Hall, right? That's not significant just because of women. It was also the 1918 flu pandemic hospital here, which is pretty relevant today. It was the first student center. It was the first campus on what they called white campus, like this white limestone area, historic women's campus.
Both white campuses. too.
And First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt spoke at Reed Hall. It's where university presidents met with students and had coffee hours. It's where
It's where students would protest because they were upset with administration. for various
a
things.
lot of organizations like the Student Government, MSA, and other student government organizations had offices in there. The Maneater, right? First Journalism School, the Maneater was in there. It served a ton of different places, but no, it is not on the National Historic Register.
I guess to that point,
Yeah.
like, we didn't mean to poo-poo that point to whoever's question that was. Genuinely, that is the most common question.
Yeah.
We would love to put it on the National Historic Registry or even the state one. Universities and other places that do get on the registry get some nice funding because of that. So there is absolutely an incentive there to do that. We would be more than welcome to fill out all that paperwork and go through that bureaucratic process to do it. However, the final brick that has to be met is consent from the university. So we don't own the building. We do not own the building, despite the fact that most of us are hunkered down in the basement typing for many hours of the day. We do not own the building. We would love to do the work. No one has to do any work except the three of us. But all we need is a signature, really. And a stay of execution.
But
Sorry,
yeah, I
the
guess,
actual
so,
question.
yes, the bigger question, if anyone has any thoughts, I don't want to.
I don't know, in
Yeah,
terms
we-
of,
we all know, yeah.
our emotional space, helping everyone feel that they belong here. We probably in our orientation, we need to start off with students, just helping them understand what we stand for.
Mhm.
You know, we stand for equity and justice at this institution. This is something we believe in. We want a climate and a culture that's welcoming to everyone, that's going to respect everybody. If this gets to be something that we all talk about and we all believe in, not in this place are we going to have discrimination or racism. That's not who we are. So this has to be on the lips of all of us until we can actually behave in that way, you know, so we can start there. I think the physical spaces are important, but yes, we have to find ways to make everybody feel that this is the place for them. And that's one way of getting started. I think it's for administrators and faculty and staff, students, every single person in this place needs to be able to talk about the university in that way and then make it a reality.
We only have one person does that with citizenship at Mizzou. That's at least one step, but that's of course one step. And that, who is that? Oh, co-director of the center. That's right.
But I think that citizenship at Mizzou could be done away with if we had a course.
No, we need a focus.
But for
And students or staff and faculty need to take the course too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Another very prominent display and promotion of history on campus is Tour Team. And Tour Team is a very good example of like an extension of the university that they share with prospective visitors, which is not just potential students and their families, but it's also like distinguished visitors who come. Like these are the people who interview and are selected to give tours to people, right? They are given a pretty like strict idea of what they can and can't talk about. Right. And so they have the personality, right? They want to appeal to people, but it's the history that they can and can't tell. That's another part of it, is that's their first step into learning Mizzou history, is that tour before they even come here, if they choose to come here. So why are we not pushing for Tour Team to have a more accurate or better tour? And so that could also be another part of this.
yeah, and there was a big controversy about them actually not walking past the Gaines Olden Black Culture Center for a period of time, right?
Or past
Yeah.
the protest.
Right.
Yeah.
And any other final comments from our panelists on this?
Tour Team walks past Reed Hall and they don't even know it.
They also misidentify like where Jefferson's tombstone is, and you would think they would get that right.
Yeah.
They don't.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, pretty much what I was saying is institutional buy-in. I think that's what it looks
Yeah.
like, because we have people here who are doing the work doing the unpaid labor, a lot of unpaid labor, taxing, but institutional bias is not always there. It's not really there at all. And so in order to change things, we're talking about tort team, like, unfortunately, tort team sometimes buys into that lie too, that the university, woohoo, you know, but we have to be honest and we have to need institutional bias to create that change. And I think that's where I'll ask for. We have people here doing the work, have people presented their own work, who have suggested work, but if there's no institutional buy-in, it's not going to happen. So that's what we need.
So I want to thank our panelists once more. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I also want to have sort of two final things. The next Middleton Center event, April 6th, 4:30 to 6 o'clock. The racialization of religion. Professor Sahar Aziz is coming to talk about the racial Muslim. Professor Dave Dunkley on our own campus talk about Rastafari women in the resistance movement. Professor Robbie Gregory is also talking about white nationalism and religion. And so we expect that to be really good. Hopefully you will attend that. And of course, as we always do, we often offer the mic to our namesake, if he has any final words. Mike has deferred. Nothing to add. All right. Thank you all once again for coming and supporting the center. We really appreciate it.